Hi, my name is Corinna Luyken, and this is my studio. And this is my newest book, My Heart. And I am going to show you some process pictures and outtakes from the book, and talk a little bit about the process of making My Heart. So on the wall here I have a couple images that are outtakes from the book that never made it in. In fact, the entire book changed, and the page layout changed, and the text changed. And so these are some images of the windows open that totally got cut. The entire spread got cut from the book. Images on the wall of the building with lots of windows didn't make it into the book, and what actually ended up happening is that pages got rearranged and the text got changed a little bit, and we ended up with this image of a single child inside opening the blinds up for the broken can mend, and a heart that is closed can still open again for that page. So then what I've decided to do, though, is to take these images that didn't work for this book, and some of what I learned about making those images is going to probably end up transferring into the book that I'm working on right now, which is called Nothing in Common, and it's written by Kate Heffler and will be out from Houghton Mifflin in the fall of 2020. And so there are things that I learned from one window image from one book that will end up as the window images in another book. So there's a fun parallel. Some of the experimentation that doesn't make it into one book, it still pays off eventually and becomes something you can use later on. So these are 8 of the book dummies that came before the final versions of My Heart. And so we have the very first one here that started off super rough. I probably didn't show this to anybody, but it was my first idea of how I might take this poem that I wrote many, many years ago, like probably 9 or more years ago. And maybe 6 years ago, 7, I started playing with the idea of how I could turn it into a book. And so this took a long, slow process for this book to come together. And I put it aside for a while and then came back to it. And as I came back to it, I started to make dummies that were a little bit more polished, but still, this one is still super rough too. But you can see I had totally different, a flip-flop, a helmet, a wheel, or a jar. I had bicycles. I had these kids and this hot air balloon. And then the book slowly became a little bit more polished, and the ideas became a little bit clearer about what I was doing, but I still had this umbrella here for open and closed. So some things really stayed very similar. The puddle is still an image that's in there, and the cloudy and heavy with rain, and this one stayed very similar. And some things changed a lot. I had this whole page where I said I had it being the fence to keep out the world, but then I had a feather delivered by bird, and then I had this whole long line about how it has its own voice and song it can sing, but it needs me to listen, and listening means to quiet the voices all gathered around, to let my heart whisper. It can't always be loud. It was a long time before I realized that I had to cut that out, and all of that in the final version of the book just turned into this one page, closed or open. So all that talk about listening got turned into an image that hopefully conveyed a feeling of being still and listening to your heart. But a lot of those words were unnecessary. That ended up changing. This is an early collage experiment that became eventually that My Heart is Tiny page, and also was a precursor to the title page with the garden heart. And this is an early idea with the cut paper. I was experimenting for My Heart. Sometimes it's cloudy and heavy with rain, and so I was experimenting with cut paper for a while, and eventually decided to simplify things. But you can see this is an early tree. There's so much in here. There's another cloudy and heavy with rain, and some experiments for the stars in the sky. And this is an experiment for a window and people building a stained glass window. I did a lot of different versions of the stained glass window and different variations of it. For a while I thought maybe the end papers would be one huge stained glass window. And the original open and close, instead of being that window, it was actually an umbrella in one of the early book dummies. It was an open and closed umbrella. And then eventually it became the window. And let's see, some more trees. Oh, for a little while I had folks, more window variations. I had folks on a train. So I did a lot of there's a lot of play and experimentation that goes into my process. I don't always know what I'm doing to begin with. And so I end up with a lot of outtakes and a lot of versions of things that didn't quite work out. Here's another. This was the puddle one. And then here was another stained glass window where I was experimenting with it being open for the back end papers and then closed for the front end papers. So yeah, you can see there's just a ton of images here that I was playing with. So for me, that's part of the fun of the process, is not always knowing what I'm doing or where I'm going to begin with, but just experimenting and playing along the way. And it keeps it fun for me. I really like not always knowing where I'm going. So some of the pages in the book My Heart were made using a printmaking process with cut paper stencils. And so this is an example of a piece of paper I started with this cardstock, and just wanted to show you a little bit of my process. That one thing that I will sometimes do is use the X-Acto knife to make a simple shape. In this case, it's going to be this heart plant, this heart flower, and I cut it out of the cardstock. And I like it when the hearts are imperfect, so I like the sharp lines and just the variation there. And so I'll cut out a little shape, and then I have two really cool things, actually more than just two, but two cool things I can definitely do with this, which is that I have you can see here, I've got this stencil, and I can pop it out of here. And then when I'm going to do some printmaking, I can use both the heart stencil, but I can also use the paper it was cut out of to create negative space images. And so I want to show you just a little bit of printmaking and how I do that. All right, so I have my tools here. I have my brayer. I have a bunch of them, actually. There's a whole assortment of brayers, but I'm going to use this one today. And I have my inks. And so what I'm going to do is I have these two stencils. I'm going to open up. Oh, this is an unopened jar of yellow. I went through so much yellow for Book of Mistakes. I'm just going to squeeze some from this tube. But these are the inks that I use, the Speedball. Water-soluble printmaking inks, and so I like to be able to clean up with water. I like to use non-toxic supplies whenever possible. Oh, that is really low. Okay, we will open up this new container. Brand new yellow ink. So then I use the palette knife to get my ink on here. And what I wanted to show a little bit of is that you can also, I use this knife for mixing, and so I don't want my yellow to be quite so bright. So I'm going to mix some white in with it. And I do this by scraping and pressing and scraping and pressing until the ink is all mixed together. And this is one of my favorite. I love this part of the process. It's so fun to mix color and mix inks. It's very meditative and soothing to kind of make your own colors and to do this scraping and pulling. I just love it. So you don't want too much ink. You just want a smaller amount here for the brayer. If you have too much, you end up with a funny bubbly texture. All right, so now I'm going to take my brayer and I'm going to roll it in the ink until I get a nice even coating on here. And then I'm going to roll this right onto my stencil. And while I'm at it, I'm going to roll it onto here, and I'm going to show you a couple really fun different options for what you can do. So the thing I love about printmaking is there are so many opportunities to experiment. And so for one thing I can do is I can actually take this stencil away. Just going to set it over here for a minute. And I have already a shadow of a thing here. So I can actually take my paper, which has some ink already on it, I can press it right onto there. And this is how I start to get shadows of things. And so I'm starting to get some interesting texture and a little bit of a heart shape. And I can use this, maybe I'll set this aside, maybe I would want to put a darker color on top of this. Another option is to take, I'm actually going to leave this here so I can work right on here. So I'm putting this on here, and so you know what I'm going to do first so that we don't have ink on the backs of things, is I'm going to now take this stencil, and it's going to be very similar, but it's going to be a little crisper than what I just did. And I'm going to rub this, and because this is a nice thin cardstock instead of a rubber block, I can actually just use my fingers and my hands to push, and I can get a decent amount of pressure to transfer. Now, because this is pale yellow, again, you don't see it really well, but this would be an interesting beginning to a layer of something else that I could add to. And then now what I'm going to do is take a little more ink here, make sure I get enough. I'm going to actually put this here, I'm going to scoot it over. I'm going to re-ink this, but I'm going to ink it on top of paper that I already have. I'm going to use paper as my backdrop, and I'm getting a slightly crisper background space image. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to place it on here. And I will put down, actually I will grab a piece of paper here. I have this wonderful folder full of printmaking textures, and a lot of these really cool papers are from, I get these really cool textures because I'm using the same papers over and over. So I might take this, and it's got some pink on it, and I'm going to use this as my rubbing paper. So I'm just going to rub. And little bits of color will slowly accumulate on these other papers from doing this over time. And then I'm going to peel back my stencil, and you can see I have a little bit of a yellow garden flower. And from there I can take pencil and I can start to draw and add to this. In fact, one thing I like to do some of the time is actually draw in the ink while it's still wet, because you get a different type of darkness to the line when you do that. And so sometimes I will draw when the paper is still wet, and I'll add some details or maybe other things that are happening behind. And I will slowly go back in and add more detail after things have dried, more stencils, more layers of paint, and it accumulates and eventually grows into being a garden